So my name's Adam Tompkins. I'm a recent transplant here to Japan. Moved from the United States and Arizona in the West. Prior to coming here, I earned my PhD at Arizona State University, and as part of that, I had the opportunity to serve as a research assistant on this iCivics project, which is, I'll discuss a bit of as we go forward, but it's an educational game that's created for American students in the K-12 system, centered on junior high and high school. After graduating from ASU, I then taught at an advanced charter school and used this game in the classes that I taught there, and it was very well received and effective. I didn't plan on using it at a college level, in part because it's geared towards a young age, and some of the language in it is simplistic, although it does get at some divisive issues, and it does have some important components about argument building. When I came to Tokyo and started at Lakeland and began teaching US history courses, what I found was what I should have expected, is that some of those base points of reference that students in the American classroom get throughout their K-12 education were missing. Just as an American student who would come to Japan wouldn't have some of the base understandings of Japanese history that they would presumably get, that a Japanese student would get in a Japanese classroom. And so as I teach US history courses in Japan, I have a dual task of teaching advanced concepts that you would get in a college classroom while firming up some of the fundamental understandings of the US experience, rights and civics that students in the United States would get earlier. And so I chose to bring this game back in. Also, as a result of my work on this project, I became interested in the uses of technology in the classroom. And so I thought that this would be a good opportunity to explore those uses. So a little bit about iCivics. iCivics is the product of, it's the brainchild of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. O'Connor is the first woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court, and she actually wound up retiring earlier than she had planned. Her husband was in poor health, and she stepped down from the bench because of her husband's condition. Now, when she stepped down from the bench, she was troubled by some things that were going on in the United States. She was worried about the balance of powers between the executive branch, the president, and the legislative branch and the judicial branch, because of some actions of George W. Bush's administrations as related to incarceration of suspected enemy combatants, and also in regards to assisted suicide. So that's one driver. She was worried that the executive branch was trying to shift that balance of power and take more control and enforce its will on the judicial branch. Another thing that she was concerned about was the declining state of civics education in the United States. And she referenced a couple of surveys, some that showed students could better identify a judge on a popular TV show, American Idol, than they could name a justice on the Supreme Court bench. And other studies that show greater familiarity with television personalities than some of the core components of American governance. And so that was disturbing to her because she thought that knowledge of civics and civic participation were fundamental to the continuation of American democracy. And so she stepped down from the bench, but she's still a very active woman, and so she shifted her focus to how to improve civics education in the United States. And she had a grandson, and her grandson liked video games, and so she thought perhaps video games are the route that we should go. Civics education was threatened in American schools in part because of the increased emphasis on science and mathematics, and schools being rewarded for high-achieving science and math. And if they're rewarded for science and math but not social studies education, then an inadvertent result of that is that social studies and civics fall in importance. Right? So she teamed up with this guy here, whose name is James G. He's an educational literacy professor at Arizona State University, and the thing that James G. is best known for is his advocacy for the use of video games in learning. So oftentimes, video games are characterized as being corruptive, as rotting the mind, sometimes corrupting morals, right, with the violence and themes in them. And G is a defender of games, right? And he has points that he uses to make this argument. One is that students have a role in knowledge creation. So instead of just being a sponge who listens to what the teacher has to say, they take an active role in the learning process, and they make decisions that alter the outcome of the gaming experience. And so G's emphasis is not on a linear path to results, but allowing students the freedom to make mistakes, learn from that mistake, come back, try again, in order to find success in the game that they're playing. Another point that he makes is that if we look at game players, video game players, they continue to play games as games get more and more difficult. Right? That even if a game seems to reach the point of being impossible, they'll continue to devote endless hours to try to figure out how to solve that. In education, it seems to be the opposite. That standards continually get dumbed down. And students seem less willing to put the time into something that seems very challenging or impossible in their minds. And so he's addressing that issue. Why will students put endless hours into a game that grows increasingly more difficult, but they won't put that emphasis into the class? And so together they joined together, and from that they created iCivics, which has a number of different aspects of it. The two that I chose to use, one is called Do I Have a Right? And the other is called Argument Wars. Both of these are centered on the United States Bill of Rights and the United States court system. So and I teach US history, so it does have, it's directly connected to the content, but I believe that this sort of game has a role in international higher education. And so if we look at 21st century learning goals, 21st century learning goals include critical thinking, evaluating evidence, connecting different pieces of evidence together, determining what's a valid argument, what isn't, and then constructing your own argument. Another point of emphasis in 21st century learning is being able to connect course content to real-life situations. And the iCivics platform does that, because what it does is it takes these notions that are at the core of American democracy, the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, protection from unlawful search and seizure, equality under the law, but it teaches those skills through more contemporary cases. And so students will, or players in the game world will have somebody come to them with a particular grievance. And they'll have to evaluate whether that grievance actually applies or is protected by an amendment in the Bill of Rights. And another goal of 21st century education is increasing global awareness and civic literacy. So in this regard, I think that it's useful for students that aren't American to have an understanding of American democracy, because by having an understanding of a different way of governing, it increases your understanding of your own. Right? That's been one of the most rewarding things for me as an American moving to a different country, is that it not only do I gain a better understanding of my new place, but it also increases my understanding of my home place and helps me identify cultural understandings that may have passed without notice. Right? So I think that it has that potential as well, and also in regards to civic literacy and encouraging political participation. With UNESCO, the World Declaration on Higher Education, one of the points of that is that international cooperation and exchange are major avenues for advancing higher education throughout the world. And I think that iCivics fits in that, or is complementary to that as well. All right, so the games themselves, the first that I chose to use is Do I Have a Right? And these are a couple screenshots from the game. And what you do in the game, what the player does in the game, is they're basically in control of a law office. Right? And they start out the day, and a client will come in and they'll bring forth their grievance. So in this one, the woman says, a police officer came to my house with a warrant, and it says that he's going to examine my stuff. Right? And then, do I have a right to not allow him to examine my stuff with that verdict? Right? And then the student, and again, international students without much familiarity with American rule of law, they start off with one lawyer, and gradually as they play the game, they build up their office. So with different lawyers who specialize in different constitutional amendments, and they evaluate whether that person's grievance actually applies or whether they have a valid complaint or not. And so through that evaluation, it builds familiarity with American law, getting them to think about course content and contextualize it with different scenarios. So they're rewarded for successful performance, and this is another element of gaming that G says is important, is that when game players are in the video game world, that they're rewarded for good performance and that they take ownership of the character in the game, that they want to see the character in the game do well, and they get upset when the character does not, and then if they can customize the game world. So in this, here's your law office. If you do well and you win your cases, you can hire more lawyers, you can do different things to the offices, and this is one of the things that the students who played the game enjoy. All right. So my rationale for assigning this is that it encouraged students to go beyond rote memorization. One of the complaints, and I hear this all the time, both in the United States and here, is that students don't like history, right? They have a negative impression of history because their experience with history outside the college classroom has been rote memorization, right? One damn fact after another. Presidents and wars in the United States. And so, as a college professor, the challenge is to get beyond that, right? To break down those assumptions and that prejudice against the discipline and get them to actually do history and understand that it's not just memorization and that it has salience in their own lives. It also has an increasingly fast tempo, and the simplified language I thought would be good for English language learners. The second case that I used is called argument wars, and in this case, rather than having a whole bunch of different cases that they don't really get to dig into, argument wars, they pick one case and they have to choose a particular side and then defend that side against an opposing argument. So New Jersey versus TLO is about unlawful search and seizure. Texas versus Johnson is about free speech, symbolic free speech, and flag burning. And they go through and they make arguments with supporting evidence. So they have a deck of, basically a deck of cards within a video game context, and they have to play, some are good, some are bad, and they have to build an argument with these cards, and sometimes the judge will ask for clarification, and so then they have to support the argument that they're making, that it's a check for understanding. So these are a couple screenshots here. It encourages you to look for weakness in your opponent's argument as well. So you play against a computer, and the computer sometimes makes mistakes in their argument, and if you call them out on their mistake, then the player is rewarded. All right, so to get to the results of using this, I used 3 measurements to test the appropriateness and utility of the use of games in the classroom. One was a video game survey, and some of my expectations weren't necessarily met with this. Moving to Tokyo, I saw arcades in much greater prevalence than I did in the United States, and so my assumption was that people gamed